Emma had never imagined her life would unravel so quickly. Just a few months ago, she was living a simple, contented life, working as an office assistant in a small company. Every evening, she returned to the warmth of her home and the loving arms of her husband, Daniel. They weren't rich, but they had each other, and that had always seemed enough. Daniel had always been attentive, showering her with affection and promising that their future would be filled with happiness. But everything changed when Emma found out she was pregnant. The day she told Daniel, she had been bursting with excitement. They had been sitting together on their worn-out couch, sipping tea, when Emma had shyly placed her hand over her stomach and said, "I have something to tell you." At first, Daniel's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "What is it, love?" "I'm pregnant," she whispered, a joyful tear slipping down her cheek. She had expected him to be overwhelmed with happiness, to pull her into his arms and spin her around the way he did whenever he was excited. But instead, his expression turned cold. "You're pregnant?" he repeated, his voice flat and distant. "Yes," Emma nodded, searching his face for any trace of joy. But there was none, only fear and anger. "Emma, how could you let this happen?" he snapped, standing up abruptly. "You know we're not ready for a child. This will ruin everything we've worked for. All our plans gone." Emma stared at him in disbelief. She had never seen him like this. The man who had once claimed she was his whole world was now blaming her for a life they had created together. "I thought you would be happy," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought we could face this together." Daniel shook his head, pacing the small living room, his frustration palpable. "I don't want this, Emma. Not now. I'm not ready to be a father, and you know it." The arguments came almost daily after that, each one more painful than the last. Daniel was adamant that a child would destroy their future, and he began to resent Emma for wanting to keep the baby. His love, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a storm threatening to rip her apart. Finally, one night, after a particularly heated argument, Daniel packed his things. "I can't do this anymore," he said coldly, his eyes avoiding hers. "You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine. I won't let you drag me down with you." Emma had stood in the doorway, watching as the man she thought would stand by her through anything walked out of her life without looking back. The house, once filled with laughter and love, felt empty and cold. She was completely alone. Her heart was broken, but that wasn't the worst of it. The next day, Emma's world crumbled further. When she called her parents to explain the situation, hoping for some comfort or support, their response was even harsher than Daniel's. Deeply religious and bound by strict beliefs, they saw her pregnancy out of wedlock as a grave sin. They didn't want to hear about Daniel's abandonment or her struggles. To them, Emma had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it alone. "You're an adult, Emma," her mother had said sternly over the phone. "This is your responsibility, and you will need to figure it out. We won't enable your mistakes." The call had ended with a cold silence, and Emma realized she had nowhere to turn. No one to lean on. Her world had fallen apart, and she didn't even know how to begin putting it back together. For weeks, Emma tried to make ends meet. She moved out of the apartment she had shared with Daniel, as she could no longer afford the rent on her own. With no steady income and the expenses of pregnancy weighing her down, she soon found herself without a roof over her head. She had no friends left, no family who would take her in, and no one to ask for help. Emma slept in homeless shelters when she could, but most nights, she ended up on a park bench, clutching her growing belly and crying herself to sleep. The world, which had once seemed so full of promise, now felt like a cruel and uncaring place. The future she had envisioned with Daniel, a home filled with love and the joy of a child, was gone. In its place, there was only uncertainty and despair. But as Emma sat on that park bench one cold, drizzly morning, something in her heart whispered that she could not give up. She had her baby to think about now, and she would fight to protect that small life, no matter how alone she felt. That day, as Emma sat with her head in her hands, a man approached her. His name was Michael, and though his clothes were simple, there was a warmth in his eyes that caught Emma off guard. He stood in front of her, holding out a cup of hot coffee. "You look like you could use this," he said kindly. Emma glanced up at him, wary. She had learned not to trust easily, especially in her current situation. I don't have any money," she stammered, looking away in embarrassment. Michael shook his head. "You don't need to pay me. Just drink it. It'll warm you up." Emma hesitated for a moment before taking the cup, wrapping her cold hands around it. She hadn't realized how much she needed that small kindness until the warmth began to seep through her fingers. And for the first time in weeks, she felt a sliver of hope. As Michael sat down beside her, Emma found herself telling him everything. How her life had fallen apart, how she had nowhere to go, and how she didn't know how she was going to survive, let alone care for her unborn child. Michael listened without interrupting, his eyes full of compassion. "I've been where you are," he said quietly when she finished. "Life can be unbearably hard sometimes, but that doesn't mean it's over. If you want, I can help. I have a spare room you can stay in, and I know a cafe that's looking for someone to work mornings. It's not much, but it's a start." Emma blinked in disbelief. She had just met this man, and yet he was offering her the one thing she needed most, a second chance. It was the beginning of a new chapter, though Emma couldn't yet see how much her life was about to change. Emma had never experienced such a mix of emotions, gratitude, fear, and uncertainty, as she did when she accepted Michael's offer of help. That night, she slept under a real roof for the first time in weeks, in a small but clean room in Michael's modest apartment. The sheets smelled fresh, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, life could start over. Michael's kindness seemed endless. The next morning, he made breakfast, simple toast and eggs, but Emma hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her. She ate in silence, unsure of what to say. A stranger had shown her more compassion than anyone else in her life recently. It was overwhelming. "You don't have to say anything," Michael said softly, as if sensing her unease. "Just take things one step at a time. We'll figure it out." And so began Emma's new life. Working at the cafe wasn't glamorous. Most mornings, she arrived before sunrise, helping to brew coffee, serve customers, and clean tables. The work was exhausting, especially as her pregnancy advanced, but the routine gave Emma a sense of stability she hadn't known since everything fell apart. She was making her own money, even if it wasn't much, and slowly, the weight of despair began to lift. At the cafe, she met a few regulars who smiled at her each morning. Some days, an older woman named Mary would stop by and ask how Emma was feeling, her eyes always glancing toward Emma's growing belly with a knowing smile. "You'll be a wonderful mother, dear," Mary said one morning. "I can see it in your eyes." Emma wasn't sure she believed it yet, but hearing those words sparked something inside her, a hope that had been long buried. Maybe, despite everything, she could still give her child a good life. Michael continued to be a steady presence in her life. Though he was quiet, there was a gentleness about him that made Emma feel safe. He never pried, never pushed her to talk about her past unless she wanted to. Instead, they would sit together at the small kitchen table in the evenings, sipping tea and talking about anything but the dark clouds of their pasts. They spoke of dreams, of what Emma might want for her baby, and sometimes Michael would share stories of the hard times he had faced in his own life. He had grown up with very little, he told her one night, his voice soft and reflective. His parents had passed away when he was young, leaving him to navigate the world alone. He had spent years bouncing between odd jobs, struggling to find his way, until he finally settled into a quiet, steady life. He wasn't wealthy, but he had learned that wealth wasn't the key to happiness. It was kindness, the human connections that made life worth living, that mattered most. "That's why I want to help you, Emma," he had said, his eyes meeting hers in the dimly lit room. "No one should have to go through what you're going through alone." Emma didn't respond right away. She was touched by his sincerity, but there was still a part of her that struggled to trust. After everything she had been through, how could she believe that someone would truly care about her without expecting something in return? But Michael never crossed those lines. He never made her feel obligated, never made her feel small or pitiful. Instead, he gave her the space to heal at her own pace. As the weeks passed, Emma began to feel something unfamiliar: peace. Her days at the cafe, though busy, became a source of comfort. She learned how to make perfect lattes and started greeting the regulars by name. They would chat with her as if she had been part of their community all along. The small tips she earned helped her save a bit of money, and slowly, the fear of being completely destitute began to fade. Michael's support remained constant, and as Emma's belly grew, so did the bond between them. He would often help her with small tasks, insisting on carrying the heavy groceries or offering to pick up things for her if he noticed she was tired. One evening, after Emma had returned home from an exhausting shift, Michael surprised her with a small gift. It was a soft, hand-knitted blanket, woven with shades of pastel pink and yellow. "For the baby," he said with a shy smile, holding it out to her. Emma's hands trembled as she took the blanket from him. She ran her fingers over the delicate yarn, and for the first time in months, she felt the stirrings of true joy. It wasn't just a blanket. It was a symbol of the life growing inside her, a life that, despite all odds, would be welcomed with love. "Thank you," Emma whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She hadn't realized how much she needed this simple reminder that her child would have warmth, would have comfort. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at Michael. "I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done." Michael shook his head, his expression gentle. "You don't have to repay me, Emma. I'm just glad you're here." That night, as Emma lay in bed with the blanket folded neatly beside her, she thought about how far she had come. A few months ago, she had been on the verge of giving up, alone and lost. Now, there was hope, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't carrying her burdens alone. But as Emma's life began to stabilize, the memories of Daniel's abandonment still haunted her. She hadn't heard from him since he left, but that didn't mean the pain was gone. Every now and then, she would catch herself wondering if he ever regretted walking away, if he ever thought about the family they could have had together. Those thoughts lingered at the edge of her mind, especially as her due date drew closer. What would she tell her child about their father? Could she ever forgive him for what he had done, for leaving her when she needed him most? These questions remained unanswered as Emma prepared for the biggest change of her life: motherhood. But one thing was certain: she wasn't the same fragile woman she had been when Daniel left. She was stronger now, stronger than she had ever imagined she could be. And with Michael by her side, she knew she would find the courage to face whatever came next. One evening, as the sun set behind the curtains of their small apartment, Michael and Emma sat together at the kitchen table, sharing a quiet meal. The air was filled with a comfortable silence, broken only by the sound of their forks on the plates. Out of nowhere, Michael looked at her with a soft, thoughtful gaze. "You know, Emma, I've been thinking, I've always wanted to start something of my own. Maybe a bakery, a place where people could come together, feel at home. What do you think?" Emma looked at him surprised. "A bakery?" Michael nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "I've seen how much you love baking, even when you're exhausted after work. You have a real talent for it. I think, together, we could make something special." Emma's heart skipped a beat. The thought of starting something new, something that could be hers, filled her with a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in so long. She had spent so much time surviving, just getting through each day, that she had forgotten what it felt like to dream. "You really think we could do it?" she asked, her voice soft but hopeful. Michael reached across the table and gently took her hand in his. "I believe in you, Emma, and I believe in us." In that moment, Emma realized that maybe, just maybe, life had given her a second chance at happiness. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life she was beginning to love. As the weeks passed, the idea of starting a bakery, became more than just a dream. Michael and Emma found themselves talking about it every night, sketching out plans and imagining what their little shop could become. Emma had always loved baking. It was one of the few things that brought her peace. Whenever life felt overwhelming, she would find comfort in mixing flour and sugar, watching dough rise, and smelling the warm, sweet scents of freshly baked bread. One evening, after a long day at the cafe, Emma and Michael sat at the table, surrounded by scraps of paper covered in notes and ideas. "What should we call it?" Michael asked, holding up a list of possible names. Emma thought for a moment, tapping her pen against the paper. "How about Sweet Haven?" she suggested with a small smile. "It feels like a safe place, a warm place, a home for everyone who walks in." Michael's eyes lit up. "Sweet Haven," he repeated. "I like it. It sounds like a place people would want to go, a place where they could feel cared for." They both smiled, imagining the bakery's future. Though it was still just an idea, it already felt real to them. They could see the shelves filled with breads, cakes, and pastries. They could imagine the laughter of customers and the scent of vanilla wafting through the air. But while their plans for the bakery gave them hope, life outside of those moments still held challenges. Emma's pregnancy was nearing its final stages, and the physical and emotional toll was heavier than ever. She was exhausted, not just from the strain on her body, but from the weight of her worries. Though she had started to rebuild her life, the shadow of the past still lingered. As her due date approached, Emma couldn't help but think about Daniel. It had been months since he had left her, months of silence and abandonment. Not once had he reached out, not even when he must have known she was close to giving birth. And though Emma was stronger now, stronger than she had ever thought possible, there was still a part of her that ached for closure. One rainy afternoon, as Emma was resting on the couch, her hand gently cradling her belly, there was a knock at the door. She sat up slowly, wondering who it could be. Michael had gone out to run errands, and they rarely had visitors. Carefully, she made her way to the door and opened it, only to feel her heart stop in her chest. It was Daniel. He stood in the doorway, drenched from the rain, his hair clinging to his forehead. His eyes were wide with something Emma couldn't quite place: regret, fear, desperation. She felt a rush of emotions all at once: anger, sadness, confusion. She had spent so long trying to forget him, trying to move on, and now here he was, standing on her doorstep as if nothing had happened. "Emma," Daniel said softly, his voice almost drowned out by the rain. I know I don't deserve to be here, but I need to talk to you." Emma's grip tightened on the door. "Why now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why after all this time?" Daniel swallowed hard, looking down at the ground. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he said. "Leaving you was the biggest one. I didn't know what I was doing, Emma. I was scared. I wasn't ready to be a father, and I let that fear control me. But I've had time to think, and I've realized that I can't live with the way I left things. I need to make things right." Emma stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. Part of her wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him that he had no right to come back after abandoning her. But another part of her, one she had tried to bury, still remembered the love they once had, still remembered the promises they had made to each other. "You left me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You left me when I needed you the most. And now, you think you can just walk back into my life like nothing happened?" Daniel took a step closer, his eyes pleading. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Emma, but please let me try. I want to be there for you. I want to be there for our child." Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You don't get to make that decision now, Daniel," she said, her voice firm. "You made your choice when you walked out that door, and I've had to pick up the pieces of my life without you." Daniel's face crumpled with emotion. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the rain and the pounding of Emma's heart. She wanted to forgive him, wanted to believe that he had changed, but she couldn't ignore the pain he had caused. She couldn't just forget the months of fear, loneliness, and heartache she had endured. "Daniel," Emma said quietly, "I've learned to live without you. I've built something new, something stronger, and I can't go back to the way things were." His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he seemed to understand. "I just want to be a part of the baby's life," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll do anything to make up for what I've done." Emma hesitated. She knew that denying him the chance to know his child would be cruel, but she also knew that she needed to protect herself. "If you want to be in this child's life," she said, her voice steady, "then you'll have to prove it. I won't let you hurt us again." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "I will," he promised. "I'll prove it." Before Emma could say anything more, the door opened behind her, and Michael appeared, his expression filled with quiet concern. He looked at Daniel, then at Emma, and though he didn't say a word, Emma could feel the unspoken question in his eyes. "It's okay, Michael," Emma said softly, stepping aside to let him in. She turned back to Daniel, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "I need time to think, but don't expect things to go back to how they were." Daniel nodded, his gaze lingering on Emma for a moment before he turned and walked back into the rain. After the door closed, the apartment was filled with a tense silence. Emma sat down, her body heavy with exhaustion and emotion. Michael didn't press her for answers, didn't ask what had happened. Instead, he simply sat down next to her, his presence comforting and steady. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Emma nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. "He says he wants to be in the baby's life," she murmured. Michael was quiet for a moment. "And what do you want?" Emma looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of the decision before her. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know if I can trust him again." Michael reached over and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Whatever you decide, I'm here. You don't have to do this alone." And in that moment, Emma realized something that had been building in her heart for a while now. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Michael had been by her side through everything, never asking for anything in return, always offering his support and kindness. And though the future was still uncertain, she knew that with him, she could face whatever came next. As the rain continued to fall outside, Emma leaned her head on Michael's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. She didn't know what she would do about Daniel, but for the first time, she felt certain of one thing. Her life was no longer defined by the people who had left her. It was defined by the people who had stayed, and Michael, without question, had stayed. In the weeks that followed Daniel's unexpected visit, Emma found herself torn between the past and the present. Every day brought new challenges. As her pregnancy progressed and her emotions fluctuated between uncertainty and resolve. She had told Daniel she needed time, but what she really needed was clarity, a way to understand what role, if any, he could play in her and her baby's future. Daniel had texted her a few times, brief and respectful messages asking how she was doing. He didn't push, didn't demand to see her, and that alone gave Emma a sliver of hope that perhaps he had changed. But despite his apologies, she couldn't forget how easily he had walked out on her when she needed him most. Trust wasn't something she could hand back to him so quickly. On the other hand, there was Michael, whose steady presence had become the cornerstone of her life. He had made no promises of grandeur, no sweeping declarations, but his actions spoke louder than any words ever could. He was there, reliable, kind, and patient. One afternoon, after a quiet shift at the cafe, Emma sat down with Michael at their kitchen table, her mind heavy with thoughts she could no longer keep to herself. "I don't know what to do about Daniel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Part of me thinks he's trying, that maybe he deserves a chance to know his child. But another part of me, I can't shake the fear that he'll disappear again." Michael looked at her, his expression thoughtful but calm. "You don't have to make a decision right now, Emma. It's okay to take your time, to figure out what feels right for you and the baby. Whatever you choose, it's your decision." His words were a balm to her anxious heart, but they also reminded her of the responsibility she carried. She wasn't just deciding for herself. She was deciding for her child, a tiny life who would soon rely on her for everything. "I just don't want to make the wrong choice," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't want my baby to grow up feeling abandoned or unloved." Michael leaned forward, his hand resting gently on hers. "That won't happen, Emma," he said softly, "because your child already has you, and you are more than enough." For a moment, Emma couldn't speak. She felt the warmth of Michael's words seep into her heart, giving her strength she didn't know she had. She knew he meant it, that no matter what happened with Daniel, she wouldn't be alone in this journey. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Michael smiled, his eyes filled with quiet affection. "I told you, Emma, I'm not going anywhere." The weeks rolled by, and as Emma's due date drew closer, her life fell into a steady rhythm. She continued working at the cafe, though her shifts grew shorter as her body began to tire more easily. She and Michael spent evenings planning for the baby's arrival, assembling a crib, folding tiny clothes, and filling their small apartment with the quiet anticipation of new life. But despite the calm, Emma knew there were still decisions to be made about Daniel. She had promised herself that she would give him a chance to prove he had changed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was holding her back, something more than fear. It wasn't until one quiet afternoon, as she sat by the window and watched the rain fall, that she realized what it was. Her heart no longer yearned for Daniel. It was a startling realization, one that filled her with both relief and sadness. Once, Daniel had been her whole world, her future, her everything. She had imagined growing old with him, raising a family together, building a life side by side. But now, as she thought of him, there was only a distant echo of what they had once shared. The love that had once felt so all-consuming had faded, replaced by a quiet resolve to protect herself and her child. She had grown beyond the woman who had been abandoned. She was stronger now, wiser, and her happiness no longer depended on someone who had walked away. Later that evening, Emma sat down with Michael, her heart heavy but her mind clear. She needed to share her decision with him, the decision she had finally made about Daniel. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady, "about Daniel and what he said." Michael didn't interrupt, just nodded, giving her the space to speak. "I know he says he wants to be a part of the baby's life, and maybe he does. But I also know that I can't risk him hurting us again. I can't go through that, and I can't let my child go through that." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I'll give him the chance to meet the baby if he really wants to, but I won't let him back into my life. I've moved on. I've built something new, something better, and I can't go back to the way things were." Michael's eyes softened, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "You've grown so much, Emma," he said quietly. "And whatever you decide, I'm proud of you." Emma felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming gratitude she felt for this man who had become her rock. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. Michael shook his head gently. "You would have found your way, with or without me. You're stronger than you think, Emma." In that moment, Emma realized something she had been too afraid to admit, even to herself. She wasn't just grateful to Michael for his support. She had grown to care for him deeply, more deeply than she had ever imagined. And perhaps, in a quiet, unspoken way, that care had blossomed into something more. That night, as Emma lay in bed, her hand resting protectively on her belly, she thought about the future. It wasn't the future she had once imagined, but it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with that. The day she went into labor came unexpectedly, as these things often do. It was early morning, and Emma had just woken up, stretching her legs as she prepared to face another day. But as she stood, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen, followed by a wave of pressure. She gasped, clutching the side of the bed. The baby. It was time. "Michael," she called out, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and fear. Within seconds, he was by her side, his eyes wide with concern, but his touch steady. "It's happening," she whispered, gripping his hand as another contraction rippled through her. The baby's coming. Without missing a beat, Michael sprang into action, grabbing the hospital bag they had packed weeks ago and helping Emma into the car. The drive to the hospital was a blur of breathless moments and soft reassurances, Michael's voice a steady presence amidst the chaos. By the time they reached the hospital, Emma's world had narrowed to the rhythmic pain of contractions and the overwhelming sense that everything was about to change. But through it all, Michael was there, holding her hand, reminding her to breathe, never leaving her side. Hours passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion. But then, finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the room filled with the sound of a newborn's cry. Emma's heart swelled as the nurse gently placed her baby girl into her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she looked down at the tiny, perfect life she had brought into the world. In that moment, everything else, the pain, the fear, even Daniel's absence, faded away. "She's beautiful," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he stood by her side, gazing down at the baby. Emma nodded, unable to find the words. Her heart was too full. In that instant, as she cradled her daughter in her arms, Emma knew she had made the right decision. She had chosen strength, love, and a future built on trust and care. And as she looked up at Michael, she saw the reflection of that choice in his eyes. Her past no longer had a hold on her. The life she had once thought was over had only just begun. The first few days after Emma's daughter, Lily, was born were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming joy. Every time Emma looked at her tiny baby girl, so fragile, so full of life, she felt a surge of love that was unlike anything she had ever known. Despite the exhaustion, there was a deep contentment that settled over her, a realization that she had finally found her place in the world. Michael had been by her side through it all. He stayed at the hospital, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair by her bed, and whenever Emma needed anything, whether it was water, a snack, or just a comforting hand to hold, he was there. Watching him care for her and Lily with such gentleness, Emma knew that their connection had deepened beyond friendship. It was something real, something that went beyond words. A week after they brought Lily home, life settled into a new rhythm. The small apartment that once seemed quiet now hummed with the sounds of a newborn's cries, the soft rustling of blankets, and the occasional lullaby Emma would hum to soothe her daughter. It wasn't easy. Raising a baby never is, but with Michael by her side, Emma felt like they could handle anything. One evening, while Emma rocked Lily to sleep, Michael sat across from her, watching the peaceful scene unfold. His eyes were soft, filled with an emotion that Emma had grown to recognize, though neither of them had spoken it aloud yet. As the baby's breathing deepened and her eyes fluttered shut, Emma gently laid her down in her crib and turned to Michael. "I don't know how I would have done this without you," she said softly, sitting down next to him. Michael smiled, but there was a hint of seriousness in his voice as he responded. "You would have found a way, Emma. You're stronger than you think." Emma shook her head, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I might be strong, but you've been my strength too. I don't think I ever thanked you properly for everything. You didn't have to help me, but you did. You gave me a home when I had none. You believed in me when no one else did. You're Lily's family too." Michael reached for her hand, holding it gently between his. "Emma," he began, his voice steady but full of feeling, "I didn't help you because I had to. I helped you because I wanted to, and not just out of kindness. It's because I care about you, about both of you." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had sensed it for a long time, but hearing him say it made it all the more real. She looked into his eyes, seeing the depth of his feelings reflected back at her. "Michael, I care about you too, more than I can put into words." They sat there for a moment, the air thick with the quiet understanding that had grown between them. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Michael leaned forward and gently kissed her. The kiss was soft and sweet, filled with all the unspoken emotions they had shared over the past months. The fears, the hopes, the bond they had formed through all the challenges. When they pulled away, Emma felt a sense of peace, as if everything had finally fallen into place. "I love you," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet of the room. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming joy of realizing that love had found her when she least expected it. "I love you too," she whispered back, her voice shaking with emotion. From that moment on, their relationship blossomed into something deeper. Michael wasn't just a support. He was her partner in every sense of the word. Together, they navigated the ups and downs of parenthood, finding joy in the little moments. Lily's first smile, the way she grasped their fingers with her tiny hands, the soft gurgling sound she made when she was content. But just as life was settling into this new, beautiful normal, Daniel reappeared once more. He had been respectful of Emma's request for time, but one afternoon, about a month after Lily was born, he asked if he could meet his daughter. Emma had been expecting this moment, and though her heart still carried the scars of their past, she knew it was time. She agreed to meet him at a nearby park, where they could talk in the open, neutral space. Michael understood her decision, though it was clear he was protective of both Emma and Lily. He stood by her side as she prepared to meet Daniel, offering his silent strength. When the day arrived, Emma felt a knot of anxiety in her chest as she sat on a park bench with Lily in her arms, wrapped in the pastel blanket Michael had given her. Daniel approached, his face lined with guilt and longing. When his eyes fell on the baby, they softened, and for a moment, Emma saw the man she had once loved. "She's beautiful," Daniel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Emma nodded, keeping her eyes on her daughter. "She is." Daniel hesitated before sitting down beside them. "I know I don't deserve to ask this, but I want to be a part of her life. I want to make up for the mistakes I've made." Emma looked at him, the weight of his words settling over her. She had spent months agonizing over this decision, but now, sitting here with Lily in her arms, the answer felt clearer than ever. "You can be in her life," she said finally, her voice steady but firm. "But I won't let you hurt her, Daniel. I need to know that you're committed to being there for her, no matter what." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I promise. I won't walk away again." Emma believed him, at least enough to give him the chance to prove it. But what surprised her most was the calm that washed over her as they spoke. She realized that she no longer held any anger toward him. What he had done had hurt her deeply, but she had healed. She had built a life without him, a life that was full of love and hope, and nothing he could say or do would take that away from her. As they parted ways, Daniel glanced back one last time, his gaze lingering on his daughter before he walked away. Emma watched him go, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. She had faced her past, and now it was time to fully embrace her future. That night, as she and Michael sat together, rocking Lily to sleep, Emma felt a warmth in her heart that she had never known before. This was her family, Michael, Lily, and the life they had built together. It wasn't the life she had once imagined, but it was more beautiful than anything she could have dreamed. And as the bakery, Sweet Haven, slowly came to life, so did their shared dreams. Together, they created a space where people could come to find warmth, comfort, and a sense of home. The community embraced them, and soon, the bakery became a beloved gathering place, filled with laughter, conversation, and the scent of freshly baked bread. Emma's life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but in the end, it was love that had brought her through the darkest moments. Not just romantic love, but the love of a friend who had become a partner, the love of a child who gave her a new purpose, and the love she had found for herself. As she stood in the doorway of the bakery one evening, watching the sunset with Michael by her side and Lily in her arms, Emma felt at peace. Her heart was full, her future bright. She had faced her trials, made her choices, and found the strength to rebuild her life. This was her happy ending, not because everything had gone according to plan, but because she had learned that true happiness came from the love she had found in the people who stayed, those who believed in her, stood by her, and helped her discover who she truly was.